The night sky above the alien world was filled with two moons, one red and one silver. Their light washed over the rocky plains, casting long shadows across the strange landscape. In the distance, giant crystal towers glowed faintly, humming with quiet energy. It was a place no human had ever seen before, yet tonight, a human had arrived. His name was Daniel, a young man who once thought his life was ordinary. He had been a simple engineer on a deep space station, working quietly, fixing machines. But fate had other plans. A storm in space, a violent burst of energy, had ripped open a strange portal. His shuttle had been caught inside, tossed like a leaf in a hurricane. When he woke, the stars were gone, replaced by this alien sky. Daniel stumbled out of the broken shuttle, his suit torn, his breathing heavy. The air was breathable, though strange, carrying a metallic taste. He looked around in disbelief, wondering if he was dreaming. But the pain in his leg told him this was real. Not far away, someone was watching. She stood on a rocky ridge, tall and fierce, her armor glinting under the twin moons. Her name was Soraya, a warrior of her people, feared across the land. Her eyes were sharp like a predator, and her blade rested at her side. She had never seen a creature like Daniel before. He was fragile, small compared to the armored soldiers of her world. Yet something about him made her pause. Daniel noticed her, his heart racing. He raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. Soraya tilted her head, studying him. She could have ended him in a second, but instead she waited. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the hum of crystals in the distance. Before they could speak, the ground trembled. Dark figures emerged from the shadows, armored raiders with cruel weapons. They had been hunting Soraya, waiting for a chance to strike. Now they saw the human, weak and alone, and their laughter echoed in the night. Daniel froze, fear gripping his chest, but Soraya's eyes narrowed, her hand tightening on her blade. She stepped forward, placing herself between Daniel and the raiders. The sight was shocking, even to her enemies. The great warrior, protector of no one, now shielding a fragile stranger. The raiders attacked with snarls and shouts. Their weapons cracked against the ground, sparks flying. Soraya moved like lightning, her blade slicing the air. She struck with deadly precision, each movement sharp and perfect. Daniel watched in awe, unable to believe his eyes. This woman was not only strong, she was unstoppable. Still, the raiders pressed harder. One of them slipped past her defense, rushing toward Daniel. He fell back, scrambling against the rocks, his heart pounding. At the last second, Soraya's blade cut through the air, saving him. The raider collapsed, defeated, and Daniel realized she had risked herself for him. When the battle ended, the ground was littered with the fallen. The air was heavy with smoke and silence. Soraya stood tall, breathing hard, her eyes glowing with determination. She turned to Daniel, her gaze softer now. "You are not from here," she said, her voice deep and steady, though he barely understood her words. Daniel shook his head, trying to find the courage to speak. "No, I don't even know where here is," he whispered. Soraya studied him for a long moment. Her people had always believed humans were weak myths, stories told to amuse children. Yet here one stood, alive and trembling but still standing, and somehow her heart told her that his arrival was no accident. From the shadows, more eyes were watching. Other enemies had seen the fight, and whispers spread quickly through the land. The human's presence would not stay hidden for long. Danger was coming, far greater than tonight's ambush. Daniel felt it too, the weight of unseen threats pressing around him. He looked at Soraya, wondering if she would leave him or help him. She did not speak, but the way she stood close, the way her blade rested by her side, told him everything. He was under her protection now. For Soraya, this was more than instinct. She had chosen, even if she could not explain why. If anyone tried to harm this human, she would destroy them without mercy. And deep inside, Daniel understood. His life had changed forever. This alien world was no longer just strange, it was dangerous. And in the middle of it all, he had found a protector who might also become something more. The night grew colder, the stars shifting above. But neither of them moved away. The warrior and the human stood side by side, their fates now tied together. And though Daniel did not know what tomorrow would bring, one truth was clear. By chance he had entered her world, and by choice she would fight for him. The morning sun rose slowly over the alien plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. Daniel sat near the wreckage of his shuttle, trying to make sense of everything. His hands were trembling as he inspected the small pack of supplies he had managed to save. A broken transmitter, some rations, and a worn photograph of his family. Nothing useful enough to fix his situation. Nothing strong enough to protect him in this strange world. Soraya stood nearby, silent as a statue, her blade resting against her armor. She did not trust easily, and she had no reason to believe this fragile man could survive. Yet something inside her refused to walk away. She had seen his fear, but also his courage when he did not run in the night attack. She had seen the way he looked at her, not as a monster, not as a conqueror, but as a person. The two moons still lingered in the sky, and the air buzzed faintly with energy from the crystal towers. Daniel tried to speak, but his words came out broken. Their languages did not match. He tried pointing at objects, saying their names slowly, hoping she would understand. "Stone," he said, touching the ground. "Sky," he whispered, pointing upward. Soraya frowned at first, but then her lips curved slightly, the smallest hint of a smile. She responded with her own words, strange and melodic. Soon the silence between them was filled with halting sounds, gestures, and shared effort. Days passed slowly. Daniel learned to follow her pace, to walk where she walked, and to stay close when danger threatened. He watched her fight when smaller raider patrols tried to ambush them. Her movements were art and fury, a storm of steel and fire. He felt useless at first, but his engineer's mind found small ways to help. He built traps using scraps from his shuttle. He repaired her broken gear with simple tools. Each time she looked at him with surprise, as if wondering how someone so weak in body could still have strength of another kind. One night, as the fire crackled between them, Daniel showed her the photograph. She leaned closer, studying the small image of human faces smiling on Earth. Her eyes softened, though she said nothing. In return, she drew a symbol in the dirt, the crest of her people. He did not understand it fully, but he felt its meaning. Family, tribe, belonging. Two worlds, two stories, quietly reaching toward each other. But peace did not last. Far across the plains, word of the human had spread. The raiders were not the only ones interested. Whispers moved from village to village. Some believed the human was a weapon, a sign of prophecy. Others believed he was a curse, a weakness that would destroy their people. In secret halls, leaders spoke his name with anger. Plans were made, traps prepared, enemies waiting. Soraya sensed the danger before Daniel could. Her instincts were sharp. Her years of battle had taught her that silence often meant a storm was near. She began to train him, at first only with simple movements. How to hold a blade, how to keep his stance, how to watch the ground for signs of ambush. Daniel struggled, his arms aching, his steps clumsy, but he did not give up. Every time he fell, he stood again. Every time the wooden training blade slipped from his hands, he picked it up. Soraya's eyes narrowed with respect, though she never said the words. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the two of them walked near the crystal towers. The air shimmered with strange energy, and the towers pulsed like a heartbeat. Daniel asked softly, "What is this place?" though he knew she could not fully understand. Soraya touched the crystal with her hand, and her voice lowered. She spoke a single word he had learned already, power. Daniel nodded, though he felt uneasy. If this world had such power, then those who wanted to control it would never let him live in peace. That night the attack came. Shadows moved quickly, faster than before, more organized, more deadly. A circle of raiders closed around them, their armor gleaming, their weapons sharp. Daniel's heart pounded as he gripped the small blade she had given him. Soraya raised her own weapon, her eyes blazing. For the first time, she did not stand in front of him to shield him. Instead, she shouted a command, forcing him to fight at her side. The battle was chaos, fire and sparks lighting the night. Daniel's arms shook as he blocked a strike, the force nearly knocking him to the ground. But he remembered her lessons. He remembered not to back away. He pushed forward, clumsy but determined. One raider fell to her blade. Another stumbled over one of Daniel's traps. Together, they fought, not as protector and weakling, but as two warriors holding the line. When the dust settled, the bodies of the raiders lay scattered. Daniel was bruised, cut, and exhausted. But Soraya looked at him with a fire in her eyes. "You fight," she said in broken words. He managed a tired smile. "Because you taught me." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not just survival, not just protection, but the beginning of trust. The kind of trust that could change both their worlds forever. And in the distance, unseen eyes watched. The enemies had learned something dangerous tonight. The human was no longer just a helpless outsider. He was becoming something else, something stronger. And that made him a threat. The days that followed the ambush were heavy with silence. Daniel and Soraya traveled further from the crash site, moving across valleys of red sand and forests of stone. Everywhere they went, whispers followed, carried by traders, scouts, and spies. The story of the human was no longer secret, and each retelling made it larger. Some called him a weapon of the stars. Some called him a sign of weakness. And in the halls of rival warlords, his name became a reason for blood. Soraya noticed the change first. Villagers who once bowed to her, in respect, now looked at her with suspicion. Old allies refused her entry to their strongholds, their doors locked tight. They feared the human, or perhaps feared what protecting him would mean. But Soraya did not care. She had chosen her path the night she saved him. No one would touch him. No one would claim him. No one would take him from her. Daniel felt the weight of it too. He could see the cold stares, hear the harsh whispers. He wondered if his presence had cursed her. Sometimes he wanted to tell her to leave him behind. But each time the words rose in his throat, he saw the steel in her eyes. And he knew she would never let him go. Training became harder. Soraya pushed him beyond his limits, forcing him to fight until his arms ached and his legs shook. She corrected his stance with sharp commands, never gentle, always demanding. Daniel cursed under his breath, but endured it. Every day, he lasted a little longer. Every day, his blade grew steadier. He was no warrior yet, but the spark inside him was growing into a fire. One night, as they camped by a river of glowing water, Soraya spoke more words than usual. Her language was still broken for him, is still broken for her, but the meaning was clear. She told him about her people, about endless wars, about the prophecy of a stranger who would change everything. Daniel listened, uneasy. He did not want to be a prophecy. He only wanted to survive. But he also knew destiny had already chosen a path he could not escape. Their quiet moment ended when a figure appeared from the shadows. It was not a raider this time, but one of Soraya's own kind, dressed in the colors of her tribe. At first, Daniel thought it was a friend, but the hardness in Soraya's face told him otherwise. The visitor spoke quickly in her language, words sharp as blades. Daniel caught only fragments, but he understood the tone: accusation, anger, betrayal. When the warrior left, Soraya's silence was heavier than iron. The next day, the truth came. Soraya's tribe had declared her an outcast. Her decision to protect the human had broken ancient law. She was no longer a commander, no longer a daughter of her people. Daniel felt guilt burn through him. But when he opened his mouth to apologize, she cut him off. Her voice was cold but steady. "You live, I fight, nothing else." But something deeper stirred inside her, a flame she tried to hide. She told herself it was duty, nothing more. Yet when Daniel smiled at her clumsy attempts to teach him words, or when he risked himself to fix her broken armor. Her heart betrayed her. For the first time in years, she was not just fighting for honor or tribe, she was fighting for someone who mattered. Their bond did not go unnoticed. The rival warlords grew restless. If a feared warrior like Soraya was willing to stand with a human, then maybe the human was not weak at all. Maybe he was the beginning of something dangerous. So the warlords sharpened their blades, gathered their soldiers, and swore to crush the human before his name spread any further. One evening, as Daniel and Soraya crossed a ruined city swallowed by sand, the attack came. Not raiders this time, but a full war party, armored and disciplined. They struck with arrows of fire and blades of crystal, surrounding them on every side. Daniel's heart raced as he lifted his blade, his breath sharp and uneven. Soraya's voice rang out, strong and fierce. With me, the battle was chaos, the sound of steel against steel echoing across the ruins. Soraya moved like a storm, cutting down enemies with brutal grace. Daniel fought clumsily but refused to fall, blocking strikes, pushing forward, surviving. For a moment, the two of them stood back to back, the enemies circling like wolves. And in that moment, Daniel understood something. He was not a prisoner of fate, not a curse, not a weakness. He was a fighter, and he would not let her stand alone. By the end, the ruins were stained with blood, and only silence remained. Soraya's armor was broken, her blade chipped, but her eyes burned with fire. Daniel's hands were raw and bleeding, but his stance was steady. Together, they had survived, and in the ashes of that ruined city, a new truth was born. The enemies now feared not only Soraya, but the human who fought at her side. Far away, in the high halls of the warlords, the news spread. The human was not weak. The human was not prey. He was becoming a warrior, and that made him dangerous. The night after the battle in the ruined city was heavy and still. The fires of their camp flickered low, casting long shadows across the broken stones. Daniel sat with his back against a shattered wall, cleaning the cuts on his arms with water from his canteen. Soraya stood watch, her eyes scanning the horizon, her blade resting at her side. Neither spoke, but both felt the weight of what had happened. They had won, but the cost was not only measured in blood. It was measured in whispers that would spread faster than the wind. As dawn broke, the silence of the city seemed wrong. No birds, no movement, only the sound of their own footsteps echoing off the walls. Soraya's instincts prickled, the kind of unease that had saved her life many times before. Daniel noticed it too, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand never left her blade. "Someone's here," he whispered, and she gave a short nod. From the shadows of the ruins, a figure emerged. It was not a raider, not a warlord scout, but one of Soraya's own people, a warrior she once fought beside, wearing the crest of her tribe. For a moment, Daniel felt relief, thinking an ally had come. But the coldness in Soraya's eyes told him otherwise. The man's voice was sharp, his words fast and cutting. Daniel caught only fragments, but he heard his own name more than once. And every time the man spoke it, Soraya's face grew darker. The truth fell like a blade. Her tribe had not only cast her out, they had sent hunters to follow her, to watch, to report, to wait for the moment to strike. It was not strangers who had betrayed her, but her own blood. Daniel felt guilt tighten his chest, but Soraya silenced him with a glare. "This is not your burden," she said, though her voice carried a wound no blade could cause. That night, as they camped in silence, the betrayal weighed on them both. Soraya sharpened her blade with furious strokes, sparks flying into the firelight. Daniel sat close, searching for words but finding none. Finally, he reached for the broken armor plate she had worn in battle. With tools from his pack, he began to mend it, his hands steady even though his heart was heavy. When she noticed, she paused, her eyes softening for the briefest moment. "You fix even when broken," she said slowly, her accent rough, her meaning clear. Daniel smiled faintly. "So do you. But the shadows were not finished with them. 2 nights later, as they crossed a narrow canyon, the attack came. This time it was not raiders or warlords, but Soraya's own kin, warriors of her tribe, armed with blades that glowed faintly with crystal fire. They did not shout or taunt. They moved with silent purpose. Daniel's stomach twisted. He saw the hesitation in Soraya's eyes. These were not faceless enemies. These were brothers and sisters of her past. Yet they came to kill her and him. The battle was fierce, every strike carrying the weight of betrayal. Soraya's blade met theirs with thunderous force, sparks lighting the canyon walls. Daniel fought at her side, clumsy but relentless. More than once he stumbled, but each time he rose, blood on his face, fire in his eyes. One warrior slipped past Soraya's defense, charging at Daniel with a blade raised high. Daniel's instinct screamed, his arms lifted in desperate defense. And then, in a flash, Soraya was there, her blade cutting the attacker down. She had chosen again, chosen him over them, chosen him over her past. When the last of her kin fell, silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Soraya stood among the fallen, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with pain she refused to show. Daniel stepped closer, unsure if she would break or harden. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. "No tribe, no blood, only this," she said, motioning between them. Daniel swallowed hard. "Then we stand together." Her eyes lingered on him, and for the first time, she did not hide the truth. He was no longer a burden, no longer an accident of fate. He was the reason she fought, the reason she would destroy anyone who tried to harm him. Far away, the warlords listened to new reports. The human had not only survived another battle, he had survived betrayal. He had stood beside the warrior, Soraya, even when her own blood turned against her. And now their bond was stronger than ever. The warlords sharpened their plans. If the human lived, their power would fall. If Soraya lived, their armies would tremble. The next strike would not be ambush or betrayal, but war. The canyon battle had left scars deeper than wounds. Soraya no longer spoke of her tribe, no longer looked back at the past. She had chosen her path, and that path was Daniel. But the cost was heavy, and the world around them was growing darker. They traveled across endless plains of stone, through forests where the trees hummed with crystal light. Everywhere they went, Daniel felt eyes upon them, scouts watching from the shadows, whispers carried on the wind. The human was no longer a secret, and Soraya's defiance had become a challenge to every warlord in the land. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke. Soraya knew this, and so she began to teach him more. Their training no longer ended with simple movements. She placed heavier blades in his hands, forced him to endure long marches without rest. She pushed him until his muscles burned, until his body begged to collapse. But Daniel refused to quit. Every fall, every bruise, every drop of blood only fueled his determination. He was no soldier by birth, but step by step he was becoming one by will. At night, when the stars lit the sky and the fire cracked low, she told him of battles past. Her voice was steady, her words simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. She spoke of enemies who once mocked her and now lay in the dust. She spoke of victories won not by strength alone, but by refusing to kneel. Daniel listened, memorizing each word, each lesson, because he knew these were not just stories, they were warnings, and they were gifts. One evening, Soraya handed him a new weapon, a blade forged from a shard of crystal tower, glowing faintly with inner light. It was heavier than the training blades, sharp enough to cut stone. Daniel gripped it with both hands, feeling the pulse of energy through the hilt. Soraya's eyes studied him carefully, as if deciding whether he was ready. Finally, she gave a short nod. "Yours," she said, and the word carried more weight than any title. Their bond deepened not only through battle, but through small moments. When Daniel rebuilt her broken armor, she stood quietly, watching every movement. When Soraya shared food from her pack, He smiled and thanked her even though he barely understood her words. Little by little, the wall between them crumbled, replaced by something neither could explain. He was no longer just the human she protected. He was her partner, her equal in the making, but the world would not allow such peace. The warlords gathered their forces, armies larger than anything Daniel had yet seen. They spoke of honor, of fear, of the danger of letting a human rise. And so they united, not as rivals, but as predators with a single prey. Their plan was simple: strike with overwhelming force, crush Soraya, kill the human, erase his name from the land. The first sign came at dawn. Smoke rising on the horizon, villages burning in the distance. Soraya's jaw tightened, her hand clenched around her blade. "They come," she said, her voice low but steady. Daniel felt the fear in his stomach, but he also felt the weight of the crystal blade in his hands. This time he was not just surviving, he was preparing to stand. That night, as they rested in the ruins of an old fortress, Daniel spoke with more courage than before. "I don't want you to fight for me alone," he said slowly, struggling to form the words she could understand. "I will fight with you." Soraya looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, at last, her lips curved into something rare, something almost like a smile. "You fight," she repeated, "with me." The next days were filled with preparation. Daniel practiced until his hands blistered and bled. Soraya pushed him harder than ever, and each time he stumbled, she forced him to rise again. She taught him to move with the rhythm of battle, to strike not with rage, but with purpose. She showed him how to endure pain, how to hold his ground even when outnumbered. And slowly, painfully, he grew into something more than he had ever believed possible. When the first wave of soldiers came, they met not just Soraya's fury, but Daniel's fire. He fought with clumsy strikes, but with the strength of someone who refused to fall. Beside him, Soraya was a storm, her blade flashing in arcs of light. Their enemies fell one by one, shocked not only by her power, but by the human who stood unbroken at her side. By the time the battle ended, the ground was littered with bodies, and the sky burned with smoke. Daniel collapsed to his knees, blood on his arms, sweat dripping from his face. Soraya stood over him, breathing hard, her blade dripping with crimson light. She looked down at him and spoke in a voice that carried like thunder. "Anyone who touches you dies." The words were not only a promise, they were a vow to the world. And those who heard them fled, carrying the message back to their masters. The human was no longer weak, and Soraya, the warrior who chose him, had sworn destruction upon anyone who dared to harm him. The land trembled under the march of armies. From the hills to the valleys, banners of warlords rose like storms, their colors bright against the sky. The whispers that had once followed Daniel now roared like fire across the world. The human was no longer a rumor, no longer a secret. He was a symbol, and symbols had to be destroyed. Soraya stood on a ridge overlooking the plains, her eyes cold, her armor scarred but strong. Beside her stood Daniel, the crystal blade glowing faintly in his hands. He was no longer the trembling man who stumbled from a broken shuttle. He still bore fear in his heart, but fear was no longer his master. It was fuel burning inside him with every step, every breath. The warlords had united for the first time in generations. Dozens of tribes, thousands of soldiers, all driven by the same goal: destroy the human, break the warrior who protected him, reclaim the world they feared to lose. The plain below darkened with their ranks, a sea of steel and fire stretching to the horizon. Daniel swallowed hard as he looked at them. "How do we stop this?" he asked quietly. Soraya's gaze never left the enemy. "We fight," she said, simple and absolute. Her voice was steady, but inside she knew this was more than a battle. This was destiny, hers and his. The enemy struck at dawn, their war cries shaking the ground. Waves of soldiers rushed forward, blades flashing, arrows streaking through the sky. Sariah charged first, her voice like thunder, her blade cutting through the first line with unstoppable force. Daniel followed, his movements rough but relentless. He blocked, he struck, he endured, each moment fueled by the promise that he would not let her fight alone. The clash was chaos, screams and steel and fire mixing into a storm. Sariah was everywhere at once, her strikes fast as lightning, her strength breaking through shields and armor. Daniel stumbled more than once, but every time he fell, he rose again. When a spear grazed his side, he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. When an enemy's blade nearly struck his neck, Sariah cut the attacker down, saving him with furious precision. They were not fighting as protector and weakling anymore. They were fighting as one. Hours passed, the battle unending. The ground became mud from blood and dust, the air heavy with smoke. Still the armies came, wave after wave, determined to break them. But something began to shift. The sight of Daniel fighting beside Sariah spread through the enemy ranks. The human was not dying. He was enduring. The prophecy they had mocked was standing right in front of them, and fear began to grow. At the heart of the battle, the warlords themselves appeared, clad in armor of crystal and fire, their voices booming commands to their armies. They sought not only to kill Daniel, but to break Sariah's spirit. One warlord charged at Daniel, his weapon glowing with deadly energy. Daniel raised his blade, his arms shaking, and for a moment it seemed he would fall. But Sariah was there, striking the warlord aside with a roar. Her eyes blazed as she shouted words Daniel barely understood. No one touches him. Together, they pressed forward, cutting deeper into the enemy's heart. Daniel's body screamed in pain, but he refused to stop. Sariah's armor cracked, her blood staining the ground, but she fought harder. The two of them became a storm within the storm, unstoppable not because of strength alone, but because of the bond that tied them. When the sun began to set, the plain was littered with bodies. The warlords' armies broke, fear spreading faster than commands. Soldiers who had once charged with fury now fled in terror. For they had seen the human survive, they had seen the warrior's vow made real, and they knew no army could break them apart. At the center of the field, Daniel dropped to his knees, his chest heaving, his blade heavy in his hands. Sariah stood over him, blood dripping from her wounds, her armor shattered, but her eyes still burning. The battlefield was silent except for the crackle of fire and the moans of the dying. She looked down at him, and for the first time, her voice softened. "You are not weak," she said. Daniel raised his head, his face pale, but his eyes alive. "Not without you," he answered. In that moment, something greater than victory was forged. The world had seen them, had feared them, had tried to crush them. But together they had survived the greatest battle of their lives. And the enemies who still lived knew one thing. This was not the end. This was only the beginning of a new destiny. The battlefield still smoked as the sun sank low, painting the sky in red and gold. The air smelled of ash and iron, the ground littered with the remains of the warlords' armies. Daniel stood unsteady, his blade heavy in his hands, his body aching from wounds and exhaustion. Beside him, Sariah stood tall despite her broken armor, her eyes burning like twin fires. They had survived what no one believed possible, and the world would never forget it. In the distance, the last of the enemy soldiers fled, their banners torn, their courage broken. For the first time in generations, the warlords had united, and still they had failed. Failed to kill the human, failed to break the warrior who swore to protect him. Fear spread faster than fire across their lands, and whispers of defeat carried into every stronghold. Daniel lowered his blade, his chest heaving. His mind replayed the battle over and over, each strike, each moment where death was only a breath away. He had not been the strongest, not the fastest, but he had stood, and in standing, he had become more than he ever believed he could be. Sariah looked at him, her gaze steady, her voice firm. "You fight as one of us now." Daniel shook his head weakly. No, I fight as myself. But with you, the words struck something deep in her. For so long she had fought for honor, for her tribe, for destiny written by others. But now she knew none of that mattered. What mattered was here, the man who had entered her world by chance, the man she would destroy anyone for. News of the great battle spread quickly. Villagers whispered of the human who fought beside Soraya. Some feared him, calling him a curse, a danger that would bring more war. But many others began to see him as hope. If a fragile outsider could stand against armies, then maybe there was a future beyond fear and blood. Soraya and Daniel moved through these lands like a storm. Where enemies rose, they struck them down. Where allies wavered, their presence inspired courage. And wherever they walked, the message followed. The human lives, the warrior protects him, and together they cannot be broken. But their journey was not without challenge. In quiet nights, Daniel still felt doubt pressing on him. He wondered if his presence had doomed Soraya to endless war. He wondered if he had stolen her future. Yet every time these thoughts surfaced, she silenced them with her actions. When she stood before him, unflinching, blade ready, eyes fierce, she made it clear this was her choice, her vow, her destiny. One evening, as they stood atop a ridge overlooking the plains, Soraya spoke words that carried like thunder. Her language was broken for him, but the meaning was sharp and clear. World will learn, she said, if they touch you, they die. Daniel felt the weight of those words settle in his chest, not as a burden, but as a bond. It was no longer just protection, it was a promise of something greater. The warlords who still lived gathered in their dark halls, their voices trembling with fear and rage. They had thrown their armies into the fire and lost. Now they argued whether to strike again or to retreat into the shadows. But in their hearts, they already knew, no matter what they planned, the human and the warrior would face them together. And together, they could not be broken. Daniel looked at the horizon, the twin moons rising once more. This world was no longer strange, no longer only dangerous. It had become his world too, not because he belonged by birth, but because he had chosen to fight for it. And because someone had chosen to fight for him. Soraya stood beside him, her blade at her side, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Her heart, once bound only by duty, now burned with something more powerful. She did not say the word, but she knew it. This bond between them was unshakable, forged in blood, fire, and loyalty. And as the stars filled the sky, she made her vow once more, silent but certain. No one would touch him, no one would take him. This was their world now, and their destiny would shape it forever.